focuses mainly on the representation of Métis and mixed cultural identities in museum and heritage spaces.
Thank you, Emma. Keisha, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, my name is Keisha. My pronouns are she, her, and I'll just go ahead and say I'm half Black, half white. I've grown up in Winnipeg all my life. I also graduated from the U of W, I think about a year ago now. Time isn't real for me. And right now I am a reporter for Global News Winnipeg and just a general enthusiast talking about all things that have to do with race and how people experience it and what that means. And I'm very happy to be here today.
Oh, thank you, Keisha. Kimbaya?
Hi, everyone. My name's Kimbaya Carrier. Pronouns are she, her. I am originally from Treaty 1, Winnipeg, Manitoba, specifically from St. Boniface. I identify as Franco-Métis and Mexican Mestiza descendants. I did my studies at the University of Winnipeg in biology and environmental science, and currently residing in so-called Vancouver, so the traditional territories of Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Basically, I guess, working on decolonizing water as kind of like my main priority. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Keisha. And finally, Christoph, would you like to go?
Hey everyone, my name is Christoph. I'm half Filipino, half Jamaican, but I was born Canadian. I grew up in Scarborough, went to high school in Winnipeg, did my undergrad at the University of Ottawa in organizational communications, and now I'm currently marketing lead at Skip the Dishes. So happy to be here.
Okay, thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. Let's just go right into our categories of questions. We have 3 categories that we're going to be talking about today. The first is food and language, the second one is family, and then we're going to end off with society. So then our first set of questions in the food and language category is what role has food taken in how you've connected to your multiracial and multi-ethnic identity? Kimbaya, would you start us off with this one? Do you have any thoughts?
Sure, yeah. So for me, both kind of like food and language were a pretty vital and important role of how I've perceived culture, but also connected with my own cultural identity. They're both kind of, to me, tangible expressions of community, our unique culture, how we connect to the environment, our values and beliefs. So growing up, I had a lot of food, specifically a lot of food surrounding corn, beans, and squash. From like the Mexican side, we would eat a lot of like enfrijoladas, which is basically beans and tortillas, sopa de tortilla. We also grew up eating a lot of chili with like beans, corn, and zucchini, split pea soup, quesadillas con flor de calabaza. And so what I really appreciate for me, for instance, on those ingredients is that they are very, I guess, important to both of my cultural communities and identities. And it's kind of a really neat way of seeing how sometimes distinct and unique cultures can also have overlapping values, specifically when it comes to the environment. Both my communities are from Turtle Island. And so, for instance, here in so-called Canada, bean, corn, and squash are, for a lot of Indigenous communities, considered the 3 sister crops. And in Mexico, they're also known by a lot of Indigenous communities as part of the milpa cropping system. So for me, kind of growing up with those and just them being such a like unique part, but also seeing that overlap has been really, really amazing. And as I grow up, kind of just seeing how they're connected. I think that's kind of a really unique part of being multi-ethnic. And I think it's very similar with language in a lot of ways. Language is really a unique way to view the world in a distinct way. So for instance, I grew up speaking French and Spanish. So when you think about even just the way that we structure numbers in French, the number 82 is 82, which kind of, when you think about it, you start to visualize, at least for me, 4 sets of 20 and then the number 2. So it's a very different visualization of the number in comparison to French. When I think of 82, I just think of the number 8 and then the number 2. And so for me, kind of being able to grow up speaking multiple languages has given me that opportunity to really view the world in distinct and unique ways. But again, also see sometimes where we get overlap in some languages, or why some languages put more value in certain things and how they're so intrinsically connected to our surrounding and to our environment. It's kind of also been kind of one of the first signs for me as an individual that I noticed how my communities may not be the majority communities here in Canada. I kind of felt very comfortable in St. Boniface. And then once I left that area, I noticed that I didn't learn English until I was like in about 3rd grade. And that's how I started to realize like, oh, wow, not everything happens in Spanish and French, mostly in other languages. And it's also helped me be a little bit more critical about Indigenous languages. I think, at least for myself and maybe other members of the Franco-Métis community, is we have a really strong tie to the French language. But that's not necessarily the same thing for the Michif language, which is also being lost at a very fast rate and holds so much knowledge about our environment. So for me, it's also kind of learning to be critical about why we're so protective of some languages and not others, why we don't have that system in place to revive some languages, especially Indigenous languages, the way that we've done so for French. I think I'll leave it at there just to give others space to talk as well and maybe share their thoughts.
Actually, I wouldn't mind chiming in because I'm almost jealous of you, Kimbaya, because I'm hearing this beautiful connection you have with language and food. But with my upbringing, I didn't get that. If anything, actually, so one of my favorite questions I get is people come up to me and they always say, so where are you from? And then I tell them from here. They're like, well, where are your parents from? And then I get to say, oh, well, my mom grew up here. My dad moved from England and then grew up here. And the befuddled faces. But with that, but I'll tell you guys the secret. My dad, he was Black. And it wasn't actually until about a few months ago that I found out that, through using Ancestry, but for free, I won't pay, but using their free services and free trials, found out that I was Trinidadian. And that said, so I've gone my whole life, I just turned 27, I've gone my whole life not having any connection to what it means to be Trinidad, the food, the culture, the language, none of that. And the only thing I had from my dad's side was he was from London, England, so from very British foods, and then growing up here, very Canadian foods. And it's interesting because I connect that to the whiteness, but people only see the dark parts of me. So I grew up with that disconnect. And I've actually met a lot of other people who are multiracial, multi-ethnic, who also felt that disconnect because, you just live in that whiteness. So So basically what I'm trying to say is I'm having an identity crisis all the time. And that's sort of my journey in life, but it keeps things interesting. And that's all I really have to add. But I just thought what you said was beautiful.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much, both of you. I do have like a couple thoughts myself, just thinking about like my childhood and then food also. Yeah, so like I didn't really grow up with like a lot of cultural expressions or influences in my family either. A couple of years ago, my grandma on my paternal dad's side, so she's Ojibwe. I was having a Christmas gathering at my mom's place, so at my Filipino mother's house. And then we started talking about my Lola. And then my mom was in the mood for baking. And then so while she was telling me stories about my paternal grandmother, she's also telling me like steps of making bannock, which is something that she hasn't made for a long time, not since like I was a very young girl. And so that was just like a very nice experience about like sharing stories about this woman who was like both in both of our lives and a very prominent person, and sharing like this food that she taught my mother to make also, even though that like wasn't from like her own culture. And at the end of the conversation, after the bannock was finished baking, she said like, okay, I added raisins in here because like your grandma really loved raisins. So let's cheers to her. And that was very nice. I was wondering, did anybody else have anything that they wanted to say about food or language?
I can chime in here. My experience has been interesting because so my mother being Filipino, my father being Jamaican, my mom primarily did the cooking in the household. So like our day-to-day was very Filipino, for lack of a better term. So like I ate a lot of Filipino food growing up, and it wasn't unless there was like Christmas or like a Thanksgiving where I would be eating Jamaican food with like my dad's side, because I was primarily closer to my mom's side. So for myself, I feel like that played into how I identified myself and my identity, because I was like, okay, well, I eat Filipino food almost every day on the weekdays, but on the weekend, I guess I'm Jamaican. So I felt more or less that I associated with my Filipino side because I'm eating these Filipino foods constantly closer to my mom's side from a Filipino perspective. I hear the Filipino language a lot more. So growing up, I felt like I associated with that side a lot more. And it wasn't until God, like my early 20s, that I was like, oh, I'm half Jamaican too. Cool. I can associate with this side without other people telling me that I'm Jamaican. So it was a lot of self-exploration there.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, like same with me. My mom like made a lot of Filipino food growing up, so then I ate a lot of that also. And then in our household right now, like it's mostly just me and her eating Filipino food, and then the rest of the family like eating like Canadian food, for a lack of a better term. um, okay. I guess since we're good on this topic, I was wondering if we'd be okay moving on to the next category, food, or sorry, family. Yeah. Okay. So Keisha, I was hoping that you could maybe speak to this first question. As a multiracial child, have you felt you've had to take the role of an intermediator in your family when we're talking about cultural perspectives and maybe like one side not understanding the other side?
Oh, yes. In a word, yes. But to delve into it further, it's very interesting. So I'll start with saying just a bit more context. I grew up with a single mom, a white mother, and who was very loving and wonderful, generous person, but also cannot inherently identify with me and my sister. And just also for more context, my sister has around the same skin tone as me. There can also be other instances where she could have, or one of us could have looked very pale, I suppose, but we both sort of tread as racialized people in this world. So a lot of our experience with sort of explaining to her, hey, this is how we navigate the world differently. It's a very tense topic, especially because we're talking to, or I'll speak for myself, not my sister, sorry, Raylene, my sister. But when I would try or endeavor to sort of bridge the gap and try to branch out and add understanding, there would be a lot of moments of tension because I'm talking to the person who shares the skin color with the people who are actively oppressing me. So it's interesting to navigate that space and to be sort of, I hope I'm understanding the question correctly, but an intermediator and trying to explain it in a way that in a way is kind of caring for the person when you're also in pain. And I wish I knew the magic solution or the way to do it where everybody could feel comfortable and everybody could feel okay talking about it, but it's just a painful, intense thing. And I hope for anybody else who's multiracial that their parents were very good, or at least the ones who have white parents or people who aren't racialized as parents, that they're able to sort of have ones that will do the work and learn and take it upon themselves to understand. But there have been some tense moments, some fights, some misunderstanding, a lot of tears. And I'll say it's a great source of pain when you see, well, your pain not be understood by your family, by your mom, by your parents. And yeah, it's interesting how that can tear a family apart and the weight it has and what that does to a person. For me, I think I'm okay, mostly, even after all that. Me and my mom connect on a lot of things and she understands a lot now. But back when George Floyd was being talked about and that was in the news, that was sort of when things really got to a bit of a fever pitch and navigating that. I'm not sure if anybody else had experiences like that or with having two BIPOC parents if things were different. But yeah, that's my experience having a white mom who was my primary caregiver. It sort of set me up for interesting challenges around race and how to navigate that with my extended family and showing up to family events with family I hadn't seen in years. And they were all blonde and blue-eyed. And I'm like, hey, so it's interesting navigating the world and bringing it up and addressing those things and the onus put on the child to have to learn by themselves, figure it out, and then to express understanding to their white family members. It's a huge burden, but it's there. And I guess that's my spiel, my experience, and hopefully someone else can add to that.
Yeah, I could probably pick up on that a little bit in a bit of a different way, especially from the immigrant side of my family, the Portuguese side. I found I was playing a role a little bit of kind of informing uninformed relatives of my experiences and the experiences of others. And honestly, I was quite surprised at the tension between indigeneity and immigration in Canada is something I've been noticing recently and exploring. Just kind of the lack of information and just kind of the political and social realities of what it means to be Indigenous right now. And almost the kind of comparison that comes out from my Indigenous family, almost like somebody's got to have it worse than the other, which is really strange. But yeah, I feel like I'm a little bit responsible for a lot of the anti-racism and decolonizing that goes on in that side of the family and kind of negotiating and challenging the stereotypes and ideas that they bring forth about the other side of my family, which I don't know about you guys, but I find really funny because they married each other and they had us, and there's still these negotiations and these topics and kind of really negative values that they have about each other that you're kind of left responsible for sewing together and blending. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I have an extended family who's also white Canadian. So then it's very taxing sometimes, and a lot of the times I have to remove myself from family gatherings just to like take care of myself. But I find that like having like a really good support system, like I have a more extended family who's very understanding about like a lot of these complicated feelings that I have about like not being able to express myself fully with like this one side of my family who like even though I want to and have like these great conversations with, it's just talking to a brick wall because they don't want to change their opinions, I find. Anybody else want to say anything about this question?
I'll try to add a little bit. I find it quite interesting too, because so specifically maybe Latin America or Central Latin America also has a really distinct and unique history with indigeneity and how we, I think as different nations kind of connect with that and identify with indigeneity, how it's been very greatly erased for a lot of our communities, and kind of now trying to reconnect with that, trying to understand what being, for instance, Mexican means. And so for me, when I like speak to like my Mexican side of the family and trying to explain like what Métis is, and it's maybe also my lack of like vocabulary that I have, that it's really, I think, hard for me to fully explain sometimes some of these complexities of why Mexico, although it's ultimately really a mix of a lot of like Spanish or Portuguese or like, you know, mostly European descendants, and then a mix of many, many, many indigenous communities. The way it played out is so different than in Canada, and how distinctively unique Métis people are here in Canada. And they just, sometimes it's hard for me to even explain that. And I think another part I wanted to bring up, and I don't know if other folks feel this way, but it's when I'm speaking to one side of the family, or for me, it's very interesting because it's like I'm either in Mexico or I'm in Canada. So when I'm in Mexico, a lot of my family sees me as the Canadian cousin. And when I'm here, a lot of people try to kind of erase, or I don't know, it's they really see me uniquely as just Mexican, especially when I am in the Franco-Métis or just the Francophone community. They just see that one kind of unique aspect. And so I do feel in a lot of ways it's hard for me to just bring my full self into conversations or communities, because people try to put me in one category and be the expert in that one community or that one category. And it's just so whether it's society or like individual kind of thoughts as well, but there is kind of that thought of like not being enough of. And I think that also goes a little bit with even growing up, like I think this was said by others too, like maybe maternal side is something they do a lot of the raising, or at least for me, my mom did a good chunk of the raising. So I do really strongly identify as being Mexican, but in some spaces I just don't necessarily feel that, because I feel like others have more of that. So just trying to navigate those thoughts and feelings, and also bring my whole self to spaces.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. I was wondering if we could talk about another question in this category, if that's all right. This one goes out to any of our speakers here today. So like, if you have any thoughts on this, please just go on ahead. How old were you when you became aware of your racial identity in your family and in society? And how has interacting with the world affected how you think about your racial and multi-ethnic identity? Has race been a topic that you talked about in your different circles growing up?
I'll go quickly. I'll be very brief because I know I just spoke. But I remember the precise moment that I became aware of my race. I was in the second grade. Me and my friends were talking about Bratz, you know, the Bratz dolls, those Bratz dolls. I identified with Jade because she had a passion for fashion. So when we were playing our game of make believe, I was like, I would like to assume the persona of Jade and be her. And I was told I had to be the Sasha, I think her name was. And I was like, why? I was like, because you're Black. And that's when it hit me. And that's when I realized. And I'll tell you, for that little second grader there, that changed how I navigated little things like Halloween costumes and who was on TV and who could I dress up as. That didn't stop me from, you know, dressing up as my favorite white princesses, but, you know, that blossomed later on into more broader questions about identity and, you know, what that meant for me. And it also even kind of piggybacking off of what Kimbaya said about, you know, almost like shifting between parts of your identities and never being whole. It also became more of a practice in doing that and changing voice and, you know, changing mannerisms and changing even thoughts at times and expressing different parts of you. And it's so very interesting when people will sort of, you know, try to evoke certain parts of you that they expect to see based on your skin. If you don't almost step into that role, you're cut off. It becomes very strange. So I just wanted to share that because that was actually a very defining moment in my life, because someone who was white defined me and limited me based on the color of my skin. And I know, again, it's you know, it's just Bratz dolls, right? But it blossoms into bigger things down the line. It starts on the playground, but it gets much bigger, much broader, and much more impactful. So that's my little tale. But I'm a Jade, for the record. Not Sasha, I'm Jade. Just saying.
I can't relate to the, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I can't relate to the Bratz dolls, but in terms of that experience of associating yourself with Blackness, I can relate to. I remember I actually didn't know I was Black until I was like maybe 5. I literally remember asking my dad, "Dad, why are you Black?" And then he was like, "Well, certain people are just different colors." And I couldn't fathom. I was like, "Oh, okay, cool. People are different colors." Like, okay, does that mean race? I don't know what that means. But then as I grew up, I was like, okay, if my dad's Black and if I'm Black, then I should probably associate myself with other Black people and other Black role models. And I felt like I externalized that. But that was also very confusing because I, on a day-to-day, lived a pretty Filipino Canadian life. So I'm kind of sitting here, I'm like, okay, how should I act? How should I talk? Who should I be based off of my skin color versus like, let me just go my day-to-day. I'm Christoph. I am who I am. It was a lot of like, okay, who are other Black models that I can aspire to look up to because I don't have a lot of Black people in my life. You know what I mean? And I don't look like any of these Filipino people. So I don't know if this is who I am, even though I live this reality. So can totally relate there.
Yeah, I can also speak to this. This is something I think about a lot. I think we probably all think about a lot. Was this like period? But I grew up mainly in a very dominant Portuguese culture. I didn't really know a lot about my mom's heritage, her Métis heritage, and it was just kind of talked about in passing conversation when I was young. It was when I was in grade school at about age 9 or 10 when I started to hear about Métis people, and it wasn't in a very positive light. I went to school in Alberta, so I'm not sure how the school system is here, but it's not very positive. And yeah, like as soon as I started to kind of come home and start asking questions, my mom kind of really began to foster and encourage conversations and aspects about that this was our identity and this is who we were. Like she really took the opportunity to open up about this and engage with it kind of aggressively against how the school was presenting it. And she did really amazing work for my sister and I in uncovering our identity and kind of providing resources and opening the door to our community again. She got our citizenship going for us just to really encourage us to go into the community and, you know, engage and really kind of be a part of this revitalization of our culture. And by the time I was about 12 or 13, I was aware that I kind of balanced these multiple identities. I didn't, a little bit differently from the other panelists, I didn't quite feel like I had to swing one or the other. I was hard fast in just being both and being different. But I learned quickly that being Métis can be a very political topic, which is different from being Portuguese, which nobody ever questioned or cared about. And I was really beginning to be questioned by everybody I met when I talked about my heritage, not ever by community, but by non-Indigenous people, which was surprising. And I got the question of, oh, what are you? You know, which I'm sure we've all gotten. And yeah, as soon as I would say who I was and just kind of be really proud of my very unique identity and being this mix, people would go into an automatic investigative disbelief of what you just told them. And that's kind of in my late childhood to teens. And even today, I'm really grappling with like kind of having to prove your ethnicity all the time and prove your identity and not fit in one box or the other, but just to be both and take up both spaces and yeah, participate in a very beautiful blend of culture. And yeah, it's been an interesting journey from age 9 to 23, but yeah, I'm sure we've had similar experiences in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll even speak to that for sure. Just the idea of trying to own even one part of your multifaceted identity. I often sit here thinking like, oh, I'm not Black enough, I'm not this enough. But at the same time, and I say that because I grew up very white. That's sort of the part of me that I think I'm got locked down in a very strange way. But yeah, I can't claim that. Because imagine if I came into a room and someone said, what are you? I'm like, well, I'm white. No, they would tell me, no, I'm not. I am, but I'm also not. But I also don't feel, because of that lack of connection to being Trinidad or just even being Black, because I think those are two separate things. And I won't get into why, even though I think those are two separate things, but I don't feel like I'm enough of those things all the time. So there is that, just to say, like, I feel all the time that weird feeling to prove it, especially when I want to come here. I can talk about being multiracial easily, but if I go in and I want to talk about being Black, I have that moment of, should I be? Am I dark enough? Am I going through it enough? And there definitely is that odd questioning where you're like, oh gosh, what am I? Am I enough of this? Can I claim this connection to this feeling? What does that mean for who I am? Oh no, identity crisis. I'm going to go on TikTok now, is sort of the way that goes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very complicated feelings. I feel that. I want to move to our last category in society. And this one again is open to anyone. What are some of the social challenges and obstacles that you uniquely encounter with your multiracial, multi-ethnic identity? And like this could be in school, the workplace, or in other larger institutions that you're in that are traditionally spaces for white men. Like, how do you make your space?
I can take a swing. Um, Less of a traditional space and more of just my social circles. I feel like for myself, I was in a really unique position. Well, everyone here is going to UW. So I went to Sisler, which is like very, very Filipino. And a lot of my friends are Filipino. And being in this like kind of like category of like, okay, all my friends are Filipino. It drove me into being, the token Black guy in a sense. But when you have a group of friends that are also racialized and colorized, right, they feel that in some senses that obviously they share some experiences, but in some ways they don't. And in that context, I'm speaking about the N-word, right? So I've been in a lot of situations, and like this is up until recently, like I'm 29 years old, like up until 2020, like it took until 2020 and George Floyd for like my primary like friend group to stop using the word around me. And like it took a lot, like these are guys that I've hung out with, people that I've hung out with since junior high that don't understand that there could be trauma associated to it because they're like, okay, well, we share a lot of the same upbringings, right? But maybe not entirely. So I think a lot of the challenges in some of the structures that I face is, okay, like how can I explain context to people that might not be in the same context as myself? The example that I use as a biracial person, and again, very unique. I don't know if this is relatable, but I know in Filipino cultures, you don't just call someone's mom like their first name. Like no one would ever come up to my mom like, "Hey Tess, how's it going?" You know what I mean? It would be viewed as pretty disrespectful. It's like, "Hey auntie, hey tita," like from a respect standpoint, even into your 30s, 40s, you're calling them by their respectful title, right? So, but if my mom's sister called her Tess, that's not disrespectful. The context I feel is in who is saying the message. So I try to explain to my friends, like, you would never call my mom her first name. It's not offensive to call her first name, but the context is withheld within the person, right? So try not to say the N word to me because the context is withheld within you as the person, not within the word itself. Like I can say the word because I am of this ethnicity, but it might be offensive if you say this word because of you not being a part of this ethnicity, right? And again, this is explaining this to full grown adults. So in terms of that biracial challenge for me, it's like, well, Christoph, you're Filipino too. Like this word should not offend you as much as it does, but it does. And it takes a lot of explaining and educating. And I think everyone on the call can relate to going through experiences of having to be an educator when you really are not a teacher. You just happen to live in the skin that you live in. So yeah, in terms of those social constructs, those are some of the challenges that I've dealt with.
Yeah, I'd love to add to that, because with me, I think at least having half of your identity being wrapped up in whiteness, you're just going to be put in a position where you're closer to whiteness and therefore closer to harm. So for me, I think I was actually grew up lucky in my friends. A lot of my friends were white. So they would growing up, so they'd never dare to like throw out the N word. But jokingly, I got called an Oreo cookie a lot. It sucks that I love Oreos. That's the sad part. I love them so much, the snack, but I kept getting associated with that. But I'll even say though, I think, at least in my experience, is I keep falling into the folly of being close to whiteness because that's how I was raised within whiteness. Those are the spaces that I was predisposed to be in. So I keep entering those spaces and I have a harder time connecting with like spaces where there's more people of color, just very naturally. But I'll also comment on in the workforce because that's sort of where my current situation is right now. It's odd because I can say, for instance, I could throw out a statistic at my work, where I work, saying, "Oh, 100% of the Black workforce there is feeling this way." I can say that as a fact because I'm the Black workforce. I'm the only one there. I'm 100% of the Black workforce. So that's to say, token is like being a token, but also then surprising people weirdly because again, they expect me to be a certain way. They expect me to, as a reporter, connect them to the BIPOC community in some way. But like I said, I am in the white spaces. I do have connections, of course, with BIPOC. It was harder to connect there, but I found those connections. But I don't think as much as they were hoping for, per se. So being tokenized and them thinking, oh, good, our link to the people of color of the city. And it's like, you know, my main circle of friends, they're white. They also happen to be queer and neurodivergent because I'm queer and neurodivergent. And so that also brings up different layers when that part of my identity comes forward. But yeah, it's very interesting when people try to tokenize you when you're half white and you're like, there's some parts of me you can't tokenize because I can't bring that forth for you. So that's sort of my experience to share there.
Yeah, I think I could have like relate to that similarly a bit. Being a Indigenous person like in the university, it's very interesting because like we have these opportunities that we didn't have before. But then I'm also thinking that like, well, yeah, I'm Indigenous and I'm an Ojibwe, but like I'm also only half, and I didn't grow up in my like family communities, and I grew up in the city, so like I'm okay without some of these opportunities, and I often feel guilty when I do put myself out there for them because like of my privilege of being in the city, and then also like being in this like white Canadian household pretty much. Yeah, would anybody else like to speak on this topic?
I can try to add maybe a little bit of a different perspective, but also maybe jump on what you said a little bit, Taylor. I think for me, like the most kind of obvious place where I always kind of like struggled when it comes more to like the way that society like builds or constructs things is usually on like any kind of survey where you have to like identify as someone or something. And I'm always like, do I go with like Hispanic, Latino? I don't necessarily love the word like Hispanic and Latino either. Like there's so much to unpack there. Do I go with like Indigenous? Some don't like, and then even Indigenous itself it's too broad, and there's just like so many struggles. And then the idea too of I think for me, like visible minority. And that's something where I've heard it being brought up in like your own unique way by different panelists, but kind of for me, it's kind of like struggling with the idea of racial imposter syndrome, or not necessarily identifying, like when people see me, they might not necessarily identify me as Mexican or as Métis or as Indigenous. And so there's a little bit of just that proximity to whiteness and just how to navigate that space as being white appearing in different contexts and different spaces, and then in others maybe not being as wide appearing. It's a very unique and interesting feeling of it's really context dependent as to whether I look like the BIPOC person or whether I look more wide passing or wide appearing. Because there within each of these communities, there's also a lot of work that needs to be done about white supremacy, indigeneity, and reconnecting Indigenous folks, and colorism. Like there's so much work that each of these communities also need to do kind of internally at that kind of, it's really what in my kind of workplace, we call tier 1. So when it's just that specific community having conversations and gatherings about specific topics, about specific kind of maybe controversial issues, you want to have it at that kind of community space before you kind of start having conversations with others, for instance, governments, about how to navigate, how does it resolve something. So I think that's going to be super, super important, because it is, there's so much to unpack, so much to dismantle. And I think, yeah, like it's obviously for me, like that individual or personal level is questioning, how does my proximity to whiteness, how does my white privilege put me in that space, that advantageous space, and how do I take that? What is my responsibility in these spaces to create more capacity, to create more accessibility to maybe others in my community that have harder, more difficult or challenging time getting into these spaces because of these oppressive systems like white supremacy, colorism, classism, because I know I do hold a lot of privilege. And so how do I even make it more accessible to like more people? Because as you said, it's a lot of the time when you see like, oh, an Indigenous opportunity, like for me, it's also questioning like, well, I hold a lot of privilege, but I also identify as Indigenous. What is the correct response here for me as an individual, I guess, and trying to really be critical and questioning whether I should be in that space, whether I should be taking up space. And if I am taking up space, how do I make that more accessible to others in my community?
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking that we could move on to the Q&A section right now. Sabrina, did you want to handle that? I don't know. I can't see the questions, if we had any.
No, we won't put any questions in the chat, but just ask me for it.
Okay, great. Sorry. I was wondering if anybody tuning in had any questions that they wanted to ask any of our speakers.
I've got a question, if you don't mind. I'm just wondering about your relationships to popular culture and subcultures and music and bands, and being, I guess, in this struggle for figuring out your identities. Are there like popular cultures or alternative cultures or bands that make you feel like you're at home, that help you to alleviate that sense of alienation?
I'll comment very quickly. I'm a huge nerd, and I am super into Dungeons and Dragons and like other tabletop role-playing games. And the ability to create a space through make-believe, through adult grown-up make-believe, that can have more people with different backgrounds and different colors of skin just inherently makes me feel at home, because it's with people who I can create with and people who know and who probably like are BIPOC themselves. So I always turn to that as my source of like refuge and belonging. And I'll say beyond that, though, I'm constantly on the hunt for TV shows and movies that have Black people that I can look at and I can feel at home with and identify with. There's always that strange undercurrent I find, though. There's always a moment where a PSA happens about like, diversity and rights that sort of takes me out of it a bit. So I'm longing for the day where I can just read through or experience something in media that doesn't have that undertone or doesn't have that like cutaway to like, this is the right thing to say. But that's where make believe comes in. So, and that's kind of sad in a way. I wish it was more abundant. At least that's my experience.
Yeah, I'm kind of on the same thread as you in a weird way. This might just be me, but when I was a kid, I was really into superheroes. Even now, I'll admit, I'm a bit of a Marvel geek. And there was something about a lot of the characters that come up seem to come from two separate worlds. And they're completely like, one example is like Aquaman. It's ridiculously, stupidly two separate worlds. But there's something about watching a character go on this journey that's weirdly similar to yours and finding out who you are and navigating these two spaces. But also this idea of, oh, you kind of have these really cool things that you can do and ways that you can operate and move around in this duality. And that was something that really comforted me as a kid, of being different and being your own mix wasn't a bad thing. It could be like a superpower of some way, or like you have tools in a toolkit that not a lot of other people have or tend to gain later on in life. And that's just a really weird pop culture thing that I kind of loved as a kid, but yeah, it's comforted me.
Guys, I really want to chime in on this one because this is such a huge topic in my mind. And I feel like there's like two schools of thought when it comes to pop culture and race. And then there's like the one school of thought where you see like us being more diverse with existing characters. So like, for example, Chloe Bailey playing Little Mermaid, right? And you see all these little Black girls, they're like, oh my God, there's a princess that looks like me, right? And for myself, that's super exciting because there's representation and you're retelling some of these stories where a character's race isn't necessarily a defining factor of who they are. She's literally a mermaid, like whether she's Black or white, like she's Little Mermaid, she has red hair, it's cool. And I find that so important. But at the same time, there's this other school of thought where there's this importance to create characters that have race as a sole part of their identity. And I don't know if everyone on this call has seen the new Black Panther, but like you're talking about two different indigenous communities. You're talking about like the people of Wakanda, and then like you're going back to this Mayan culture and like this Mexican indigenous culture where those characters, they're primarily rooted within their culture, right? You can't have Wakanda outside of Africa. It wouldn't make sense. They need to primarily look like they're poor, but obviously they run their shit, right? So I think there's these two like important schools of thoughts where like representation is important, I think, where characters don't necessarily have their race as their part of their identity, and the polar opposite. It's also important to build characters and brand new characters and not try to, you know what I mean, make Idris Elba be 007, right? Like let's build characters that are meant to be their culture and like their ethnicity is their power. So this, and I'm going to reverse and totally go off topic, but this is so important to me because like I remember growing up, and I'm going to date myself, and I don't know if everyone on the call is familiar with Fifi Dobson, but she was a thing in the early 2000s. And I remember watching an interview about her, and they called her, oh my gosh, they were trying to, it was, I have to search it up now, but they literally called her Brandy Spears. And it was like, you're like, whoa, okay, she doesn't sound anything like Britney Spears or Brandy. She's literally making pop rock music, but because she's Black, you're like, she's got to be Brandy. So to me, it's like, okay, you're always going to be fit in these boxes until like pop culture catches up and gives spaces for people to exist. But that's my 2 cents on it. I could talk about this for hours, so I'll give someone else a chance.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Swelling.
Sorry.
No worries. My question is more for kind of Keisha and Christoph. As a person who can be considered a color visible minority in some spaces and not colored enough in others, myself, I really have a hard time sometimes on understanding where people want me to fit in, like which box. I'm Black and Indigenous people from Brazil, from South America, but I also have a Portuguese heritage from my dad's side. So um, in some spaces, I am Black, I am Indigenous, but in so many other spaces, people see me as light colored, so they won't understand the struggles that I go through, uh, as of course are going to be different as a person who has a skin tone darker than mine. Of course, I'm not putting myself in the same space. So I wanted to ask you guys, how do you navigate those situations where in some spaces you are Black and you are a person of color, and in other spaces you are just, oh, you have the privilege, you are white enough, you know what I mean? So I wanted to know kind of like your intake on those hard situations and how you deal with those, because for me this is the harder part of being multi racial person. So I always like to hear that input whenever I get a chance.
I'll be very brief since I know we're coming up on time and I know I'll have to go very soon. But I just want to say it's never easy. What I usually do is I make it into a game, which I know it sounds odd. But if people sort of expect me to be one way, if they expect me to zig, I like to zag. I like to challenge people. Sometimes if I'm feeling especially brave, I'll call them out a bit. But in situations where, like, let's say if I'm like around a lot of like Black people who aren't half white or half anything, I sort of try to kind of say, okay, what do they have to say, and listen more. And sort of, it's almost like, okay, I'm going to try and honor those spaces. I'm going to try and listen more. And I'll just try and be me. But when I'm in those spaces where, yeah, where I guess when you're kind of, I guess, hierarchy in a very strange way changes when suddenly you're on the bottom and top. Yeah, if I find myself, I feel like I'm on the bottom. I play games. I'm a trickster. I try to have fun with it. And that makes me happy. That helps me cope because it is a coping thing. But when I'm in spaces where I'm with a lot of BIPOC, a lot of Black people, and they are quote unquote more Black than me, which I know is an odd thing to say, but that's how I feel. I just try to be respectful, try to be nice, and try to listen more than anything. And it's odd to sort of navigate those two different lanes, but yeah, it's never easy and it's tough, and you just got to take each moment in stride, I guess.
Such a complex question, Sue Ellen. I know we're 1 minute over. I mean, I think everyone deals with it differently. I can relate, like, I know in Filipino cultures, like the lighter, the better. I've been offered papaya soap, which is whitening soap, which is weird. I'm like, I don't think that's going to work on Black skin, but I don't think I'm getting any lighter. I've typically approached it from an empathetic standpoint. I try not to be combative because I know sometimes some of these questions can come from places of experience, right? It's like, okay, is this person that's talking to me darker than me, and have they experienced something worse than me because of the result of their skin, right? In times that I've gone through this, even on the Filipino side, which tends to be like, let's not talk about these types of problems openly. I try to empathize with it, right? Like if someone's offering me papaya soap, is it because they are like, oh my God, someone told them that they need to be whiter while they're growing up, right? It depends on the interaction as well. If these are long-term relationships that I have with people in my life, I mean, the content of my character, I find, speaks over time, and I try not to dig into these things until I'm more comfortable with the person. If it's a quick interaction and, you know, someone's not looking to be educated, unfortunately, I've internalized it, right? I try not to be combative. I try not to educate people that don't want to be educated about certain things, especially if you can tell that certain questions are coming from a place of harm and malice versus a place of like genuine education. Because it's not like I haven't had people like in that are white that genuinely go like, oh, people made fun of you for your curly hair. Like, I have curly hair too. You know what I mean? Like, they're not trying to be malicious. They're just trying to relate and empathize. So there's a number of ways of I've personally dealt with it. Like if it's a long-term game, you know what I mean? Eventually the color of my skin doesn't matter as much to that person. If it's a short-term game and that person doesn't want to be educated, you don't have to you don't have to educate them. And if they do want to be educated, you know what I mean? I find for myself asking questions is a lot better than trying to explain something to them, because a lot of the time that question's coming from something that they've experienced themselves.
Thank you. That was really nice answers and input. I like the game idea of playing it in my head like a game. It sounds fun and less stressful than the reality that we have to deal with every day.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think we're going to call it an hour now. Thank you everyone for coming in, and especially to our amazing speakers. I love these kinds of talks. It was great hearing from all of you. And I hope everybody has a good weekend. Thank you for stopping by.
Thanks, everyone.